Hello and welcome to IH Talks. I'm Christopher Walker from International House Bielsko-Biała, and today we are talking about thought-provoking storytelling with Xana de Nagy. Hello, Xana.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, you got the name right.
And Xana, where are you right now then?
Right. I'm in Lisbon, but I work with IH World. So I'm the YL advisor for IH World.
Oh, perfect. So you'll be able to tell us all about storytelling in the young learner classroom and why it's perhaps interesting to consider more provocative topics. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I wrote this. I wrote an article recently for the journal, as you know, about this, but it was also based on a session I ran at the recent Young Learner Conference in Rome. I've always been sort of passionate about, storybooks, and it's unfortunately my kids are too old now for me to pretend that that's why I buy lots of picture books, etc. I buy them for me. But of course, every young learner teacher spends a lot of their time, I think, telling stories and using stories in the classroom. And so because I'm passionate about books, and obviously, if you go into any sort of, bookshop in the UK, you'll pick up very easily 3 or 4 books that often cover sort of what could be called sort of a controversial subject, right? And so I recently bought a few of those, and it sort of made me think, can I use this in the class? Is it going to be a problem to discuss some of these issues in class? So that was sort of the motivation behind the session and the article, and it sort of made me think a lot. Sort of it was thought-provoking for me, but also in talking to other teachers, talking about their different contexts, and if it was appropriate or not to discuss certain topics in their contexts.
And I suppose that context would be very much geographical as well as anything else, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we often sort of see on the news, cases of where, teachers have got into trouble for discussing certain topics in class, right? And it's sort of, as an English language teacher, where sometimes, our role is quite peripheral to the child's sort of mainstream education. It sort of made me think, is it our place to discuss some of those topics? And of course, any young learner teacher could pick up any of the books that I mentioned in the article, or any other book, and think of 20 different ways of exploiting it for language or for skills development. How many prepositions are in the story, or the use of adjectives, or it's sort of a springboard for a writing activity or reading or whatever. But sometimes it's nice to use the story just to sort of discuss the issue itself. And then you sort of come across sort of all other sorts of problems, because sometimes the children don't have the language they need to discuss those topics. So if the teacher can speak the child's L1, then maybe it's something that you could discuss with them. But then you need to be very careful. And the general consensus that I got from doing the session, and talking to teachers from, IH schools from many different countries, was that they'd love to be able to discuss these topics, but it's not always appropriate. And I think that's the issue.
And I suppose in some cases, you can't even predict which topics it is that shouldn't be discussed or shouldn't be touched upon too much. I remember attending a talk by, I think it was Catherine Billsborough, when she talked about how in the Arabic speaking market, they want you to shy away from topics even that begin with the letter Z. So talking about the zoo, for example.
Exactly right. So yeah, it is very much dependent on the context, geographically, but also one thing, that even within what you might think is a sort of quite neutral topic, in some contexts. I mean, I remember sort of teaching in quite a conservative private school here in Lisbon, where your audience is not so much the context in terms of geography, but your audience. You might have a very conservative group of children, or who when they go home at the end of the day, their parents might not like that you discuss something which you thought was quite neutral, but in fact goes against maybe their belief system.
Of course. And there's also, I suppose, the filter then of the message. What you tell your students is not what they will tell their parents. They will kind of reconstitute it in their own minds and relay what they can of the experience. And it might not always be a particularly accurate retelling.
Exactly, right. So I think it's important to think carefully about your choice of stories. I wouldn't say don't use these, right? I would still use them, and I have done myself. But I think you need to be very sensitive. You need to know your audience. You need to know what's acceptable and what's not, and also to sort of frame the story carefully, and make sure that there is also sort of a language learning element to your use of the story. So, from the parents' perspective, they can also see the benefit of using the story, that it's not only to discuss the issue, but also that they can see that their children can sort of make progress in terms of their language learning.
Wow. Okay. So if I can summarize then, essentially what you're saying is that there are many books out there that are suitable for the younger reader market that we could use in our language lessons. And it is good for us to consider using books that touch on more sensitive subjects, provided we are sensitive to cultural constraints and to our audience, and that the language issues, of course, must predominate. They must be the central justification for what we're doing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But use stories, because I think they liven up any young learner classroom.
Fantastic! Wow, I love it. Thank you so much. So thank you, Xana, so much for your time today. And this brings to an end our IH talk.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.